I think that we often hear on the left this line, we must do both, which is, of course, fight racism and fight capitalism. And Walter, in some of your earlier comments, you had sort of alluded to this. And I think, on the one hand, this statement is pretty unhelpful because, as you said, Walter, like in a way, it's very obvious. Of course, we're going to fight racism and we're going to fight capitalism. But I think, on the other hand, it doesn't really tell us much about what to do.
Right.
So I wonder what you guys make of this. Is this the right way to think about our political commitments? And then, Adolph, to borrow a line that you used, why can we not split the difference between anti-racism and anti-capitalism?
Okay. Well, yeah, I'll start out because I've been talking about this kind of lately anyway. In the first place, there's like no such thing as a race-class dichotomy, right? And there's no such thing as being class reductionist. Or if there is such thing as being class reductionist, what it means ultimately is recognition that race is a species of a genus of ideologies of ascriptive difference, that is, notions of difference based on what you supposedly are rather than what you do. That's a version of what I mentioned in my white supremacy comment. And I mean, here's the deal. Hierarchically organized societies can't sustain themselves just based on coercion, right? Well, some people like to think that, but it just doesn't work that way. So you need to have like some consensus, right? Some popular understanding that things are the way that they are because the way that they are, and that's nature. What these ideologies of ascriptive difference do is, as I said kind of earlier, is they sort people into these taxonomies, right? These taxonomies of arbitrarily constructed groups, right? Races, religions, like whatever. And assign them or construct around them sort of just so stories about why everybody seems to ought to be where they seem to be in the system of hierarchy, right? Race emerged and evolved as such a category, sometime over the last 300-400 years, depending on how you want to count and where you're looking at the moment. And it's worked to justify the emerging sociology and cultural or sociological and cultural order of capitalism as a political, economic, and cultural system, right? So in that sense, you can't really conceive of race, or it makes the most sense, certainly, because people can conceive of anything, right? But historically speaking, race has emerged out of developing capitalist political economy and social control dynamics. So it's not separable from it. And see, this is one of the reasons that I think it's worth challenging, or rather, I don't know if it's worth challenging. One of the things that's problematic and insidious about the stuff that people like Kendi and the Afro-pessimists and other primordialists, right, deploy about the race idea is that they want to disconnect it from the historical and social processes in which it's always been embedded, because those have been intrinsically linked to the development of global capitalism from the very beginning. But the irony is, Walter and I both have pointed out many, many times, is that making the move that they make, right, that is the move of insisting that racial hierarchy or race ideology is transhistorical and transcontextual and primordial, even though some of them don't want to admit that they're saying it's primordial. They say, well, it's only been around for 500 years, so I'm not saying, right, like in your DNA. But the move that they make is exactly the move that Victorian racists like Madison Grant and William Z. Ripley and others made, right? They read, by reading race as a discourse of inequality or a system of inequality above and across the particular social structures of accumulation might be one way to put it. What you're doing by definition is reading race into nature, and that's the way that you get a race class dichotomy, right? But if you don't take a primordialist view about what race is, and take a view as Walter and I both devised quite independently of each other, I think before we even knew each other, seeing race as much more the equivalent of unicorns, right, than of anything concrete that actually lives within history, then you don't see a race class dichotomy, and you see race as well as other discourses and practices of segmenting populations, right, into artificial taxonomies as intrinsic mechanisms of capitalist, legitimation dynamics. So
yeah,
that,
I was going to say, Adolph and I agree on virtually everything. We talk a lot about this stuff. Obviously, we write together, we send this stuff together. But there are sort of 2 points of, I don't know, potential difference. One is the history thing, which maybe we'll get to. But the other is, so Adolph began by saying there are no such things as class reductionists. So I don't know. I'm feeling like I might be coming out as a class reductionist. I'm at least class reductionist curious. I'm not there all the way. I'm moving in that direction. So, and I think it's relevant to, what's the source of this curiosity? I mean, no doubt it has complications that I can't quite, take psychoanalysis or to deal with. But
bathhouse.
Yeah, right. And part of the feeling is that, you want to say, in terms of solving the problems of inequality and solving the problems of inequality, including the racial problems, the kind of basic intuitions, not even intuition, it's an obvious point, that doing it universally is more effective both for Black people and for white people, for all people of color and for white people, than it is to do it by the anti-racist route. It's kind of obvious. I mean, and the way I always think of this is just, and I don't know, maybe, Jim, we talked about this a little bit way a year ago, but I can't remember. A lot's happened since then. If you look at, where the imposition of the race class dichotomy shows up, and you look at a profession like CNAs who make $23,000 a year and cannot live on what they do and do a very hard job, but not a job that requires a lot of education of a certain kind. And they tend to be overwhelmingly women and largely women of color. And you think, well, look, the anti-racist program is, and it's obviously true, these people are funneled into these really bad jobs because they're women, that's sexism, and because they are women of color, and that's racism. So what's the happy ending? One version of the happy ending is that we should have more white guys doing those jobs. But it's not like a better world when white guys are being paid $24,000 a year to do these backbreaking jobs. No, it's a better world if no one's paid $24,000 a year to do these jobs. People are paid a living wage to do these jobs under satisfactory working conditions, under ways in which, instead of our social goal, being able to create the possibility for people to escape bad jobs, we're trying to take the bad jobs and make them good. That seems to me pure class reductionism. You don't even need to have the fucking concept of race to work that one through. And if you look at the actual practical problems now, if you look at the problems of who's getting promoted, at Goldman Sachs, then you think, well, people of color don't get promoted as often as the white people do. That's not a problem I've got interested in solving. Who cares who gets promoted, at least as a kind of left social project at Goldman Sachs? That's a problem of discrimination. No doubt it's the wrong thing. They shouldn't do it. But everything they do at Goldman Sachs is the wrong thing. They shouldn't be doing it. So as I say, I'm kind of increasingly tempted by a kind of class reductionist way to think about this. And the kind of class reductions I'd be interested in is precisely when we say, when we're doing it in terms of employment and labor markets, let's stop worrying about who has which jobs. let's start worrying about the jobs. And we can describe our ideas about justice in terms of the jobs without ever thinking about who has them.
Right. Oh, Walter, I'm with you all the way on that, man. I mean, I don't see, because even when you make the point that these women are funneled into these jobs because they're women and they're POCs, like the picture that popped into my mind is, okay, well, why didn't Melody Hobson get funneled into those jobs, right? And the answer is because she had class resources that saved her from it. So it all comes back to class and political economy, and the impulse to kind of leave the immediate and empirical realm for explanation, right? And to go instead to reach for the legacy of some shit, right? Like, well, right. I mean, the Trinidadian woman who is probably documented, but who is here, working in a nursing home, is a victim of centuries of Brit colonialism in the West Indies. Right. No matter what composition of African or South Asian, right? She's her parentage is. That's an hypothesis you don't need, right? Like, you don't need to parse the historic legacy of slavery. I'm sorry, I just had to on that.
I'm not allowed to say it. That's one of the good things about hanging out with Adolph. There's certain things that I deeply, deeply want to say, but I'm just not allowed to say. And within 10 minutes, I can be pretty sure he's going to say them. So it's one of the things about that would be that and that goes to the history stuff, which is that, I mean, reparations is the obvious version of this, but there are lots of them. If you think about, so I live a little bit south of Evanston, and there is a kind of limited form of reparations for people who've been unable to get into the housing market or redline in the past. But if you're committed to universal decommodified housing, the account of why you don't have housing now is completely irrelevant. If you don't have housing because your great-great-great-grandmother was a slave and you've got a legacy of slavery, and if you don't have housing because your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slave owner, but like he blew it all on women, wine, and more slaves and so on, and left everything, it doesn't fucking matter. You don't have housing. The public good requires you to have housing. If we're committed to the public good, we don't primarily care about the causal account of why it is you don't have enough for a mortgage. What we're not committed to do is getting you into the mortgage market by returning to you essentially private property, which you ought to have owned. We're committed to the public part of it. The public part, socialism in general, makes the history of how you came to be unequal irrelevant. What we want to do is make everybody equal. We don't need to do, and this is exactly what Adolph was saying there, is give people have good and bad accounts of how that inequality worked out. The good and bad accounts of how the inequality worked out is exactly what Chicago neoliberal economics began with. That's kind of at the core of it. And the whole point for us as socialists is we don't give a fuck. Whatever caused inequality, we're interested in getting rid of it, not in figuring out who deserves it and who doesn't deserve to have a mortgage, who deserves the house and who doesn't.
Walter, I 100% agree, and I want to dive more into the history for and against in a little bit. But I have a really quick follow-up question for Adolph, which is that, I think that I, of course, agree with your remarks on kind of the false dichotomy between race and class, but I have noticed that recently, or maybe not so recently, there's a kind of bastardization of that, where, people will say like, well, like race and class, like you can't really separate them, or like they're, you can't distinguish racism from capitalism, which of course, as I think Walter, the last time we spoke, you pointed out means that you get a formulation like racial capitalism, right? Or this idea that if you are attacking racial disparities, you're somehow also challenging capitalism. What do you make of this? Or actually, like, to invoke history again, how far back does this argument go, and how do we respond to it?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I know that argument goes back at least to the early 1970s, right? And it was kind of around the new communist movement, right? That Max Elbaum has written about. There was a lot of chatter, right, about multiple oppressions, sometimes triple oppression of black women, for instance, and attempts to formally elaborate how the multiple oppressions came together and who has it worse and whatnot. Whether it's older than that, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, my sense about it, and this just might not reflect anything more than the trajectory in which I experienced it. But there was a little tiny nodule that came out of the meltdown of SDS at the end of the 1960s, of sort of ultra-left Marxoid types who argued against separate black movement divides the working class, separate women's movement divides the working class, and more than a principle, right? That stance reflected a kind of tone deafness about the way that things were going on in the world at that point, and left a number of portholes open for a version of a Michael Lind version of Marxism, basically. And then and we started to see that like in the late 70s and the early 80s too, around what was then called the white ethnic revival. But within the Marxist left in the U.S., the emergence of this solar system of sort of Maoist, Marxist, Leninist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist politics was the first, was I think, where at least in modern memory, both andism emerged, and that's why a number of the icons who contemporary both andists cite and point to, from back in the day, are people who were involved in the first wave. I'm not going to mention any names, but people who were involved in that 70s dynamic. But a big problem with all that, right, is that all that kind of discussion actually reverses the intellectual trajectory, right, of how we should go at questions like that, right? I mean, I think we need to start out always from the empirical relations, and then sort of draw the theoretical, generalizations from those, or at least let empirical facts on the ground and and dynamics that are unfolding around us suggest to us how it makes sense to try to establish causality, instead of coming in as all these people do, right? And I mean, the multiple oppressions people a half century ago and the both and people now, they basically have a catechism, right, that's constructed somewhere to satisfy some more or less, sophisticated, I lean toward less most of the time, criterion of internal consistency, right, that they then go out and try to impose on the world. You know what I mean? So both andism, just like intersectionality, right? I mean, the first time I read the intersectionality stuff, which was a long time ago, my first thought was, okay, well, how do you imagine these bounded and rounded off identities that the intersectionalist theorists describe as coexisting inside the head and the lives of a given individual in the present? Like Sybil, maybe, till Sybil was exposed to what Sybil was, but that's just, people don't go from their womanness to their blackness to their lesbianness, but to whatever. So it's like, I don't know, this way of thinking about social structure, right, seems to me to be wrongheaded fundamentally, right from the very beginning, as a Marxist, I think it's fundamentally, well, especially as a Marxist, I think it's fundamentally wrong-headed.
And, if you just think about both and, I don't think there is a general theoretical answer to that, which is why it keeps on being asked. It does always get asked. But you think about what it means when it's asked. So, like, if someone's talking about, it really is true. Both Black people and women are, like, unbelievably underrepresented among, like, CEOs of major American corporations. And so I want to do both and. I want to solve the problem of there not being enough, Black heads of major American corporations, and I want to solve the problem of there being American corporations. Those two things are not like a both and situation.
Right.
And what you want to do is solve the second one. If you're a socialist, you want to get rid of the corporations.
Right.
So it's a secondary thing. Yeah, as long as we have the corporations, no doubt it's better that they are gender equal or gender more representative, more proportional. Same thing was true with race and everything else. But one of those things is more fundamental than the other. And the one that's more fundamental is getting rid of private corporations, not making sure that women are 51% of the heads of private corporations. So when you're doing both and, if you really are trying to do the first part of your both, what you're doing has nothing the fuck to do with the second part of it. You're not doing both and. You're talking both and, but you're doing, no, what I really want is, like, it's really bad that people are discriminated against. It is really bad people are discriminated against. No one's denying that. But if you're focusing on that, the other part of the and, which is that the whole job structure is the problem, actually is ruled out right from the start. So I think it's a matter of, like, when people raise both and I want to say it is the single thing people like most to say. I have never been in a room talking about this where people didn't ask about it. And that's why I sort of started to think that no general answer can satisfy them, but particular answers sort of can. And
right. Well, I'll say one more thing about that too, Walter. Just, pick up on your last point, which is obviously correct. It's even worse, right? In the sense that if you argue that both objectives are equally worthy, well, it's a lot easier to, and especially now, since 1965, to realize the first objective, that is, the Beckerite objective, right? But the Beckerite view of social justice, that then is to realize the second one. But what's at least implicit in pursuit of the first one is that that there's something about getting more Blacks or more POCs and women into decision-making positions in corporations, or say on the Supreme Court or whatever, that automatically will lead us, bring us a little bit closer to the bigger objective. And what happens, of course, is that that's not the case. But when such people do, get the brass ring, then their minority status, right, becomes part of the arsenal that they and their confreres can use to combat, I don't know, the unionization of Amazon, right, or an abolition of the corporation. So it's even worse, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And you could actually make a more plausible version, right, that even we might be thought to accept. So we're thinking about police stuff and police violence, police brutality. So in Chicago, it's the thing, we ought to have more Black policemen. And it makes complete sense. We should have more Black policemen. It's, it should be more in touch with the population. And then you can make the kind of arguments Adolph was just making. They'll have better relations to the community. There'll be less police violence. But of course, and that may well be true, right? That there would be less police violence. It'd be more, but it's not as if, like, white cops would never kill white people, right? If we go back to, like, 2020 and look at where we have full numbers of unarmed people killed by the police, the largest number of unarmed people killed by police, as we know, are white. But of course, Black people were disproportionately killed by the police. You want to say, well, the real problem we solve by getting more Black cops is not exactly the problem of people getting killed by the police. It's the problem of Black people getting disproportionately killed by the police. But that's like you're saying, we got a problem. This guy, he beats his kids, and he beats his son every day twice. And he beats his daughter every day once. And someone's saying, we got to solve that, man. We got to make sure that he beats them each just once a day. That'll be fair. That's not the problem, that he's beating one of them too often. The problem is that he's beating the kids. So there's a kind of superficial plausibility, with the sort of moral black cop thing, and actually maybe even a real plausibility. Proportionality is in some sense better than disproportionality. But if the fundamental problem is the distribution of property and the role the police play in defending that distribution of property, what color of skin they have is not going to be fundamental to determining how that one comes out.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe. You can also watch the full episode and catch our future live streams by clicking the join button below and becoming a Jacobin YouTube member. Thanks.